Hey, what's going on guys? Today we're going to be talking about the Radiance or Holy based spells in Lords of the Fallen. Going to tell you guys how they work, how good they actually are, and I'm going to go ahead and put them in a tier list and rank them because that's just what I do like all the time. Now, spells in this game tend to be secondary options to your build, which actually can be kind of unfortunate. I wish they were more viable as primary options because at the moment they tend to be very expensive and there's not a reliable way to actually regen your mana. The only way to actually do it is by having finite items. I wish there was like an infinite use mana flask that you could replenish like we have with our main healing item. But as for today's video, there's not going to be any types of spoilers for like bosses or end game whatsoever. And as for the locations of all of these spells, I don't have the gameplay for them unfortunately, but I'm still going to tell you guys roughly what area you actually do acquire these from. But yeah, that out of the way, let's just get started. Now starting off right at the bottom, we have Barbed Aura. Now this spell actually does encompass your player character with a radiant aura, of which when enemies hit you, they end up getting damaged back themselves. Now this spell sucks because the damage is straight doo-doo trash. You have to get hit just to benefit off it, which I don't need to explain as to why that's a terrible thing. You can't even block to actually benefit of it as well. You have to actually get hit. It has a 22 radiance requirement, and the mana cost is not cheap. It costs 6 mana on its initial cast, but then every second afterwards, while the buff is active, it actually consumes 2 mana. So while this spell is active, you're basically just draining your mana bar the entire way down. And the buff actually only wears off after you run out of mana. But I actually did find another strat of what you can do is just unequip the spell itself and then it will actually end the buff. But the fact that that's the only way to actually end it, otherwise you just drain your mana bar, is as a terrible design, and this spell definitely deserves to get at the bottom. Number 19, we have Briar Storm. Now this is an AoE based spell of which summons a bunch of these blade based thorns. And the range of this spell is actually really good, but unfortunately once again the damage is just not there. Now you do actually do that blood loss build up as well, which can actually result in a bit more damage, but it's still not worth using whatsoever because it's like a longer animation and you actually get staggered out of it very easily. And obviously the longer that you hold on to it, the more mana that it does consume, and you end up draining like half your mana bar without even killing a single thing. And it also requires 35 radiance, so yeah, there's not much good about this spell. Number 18, we have Radiant Guardian. Now this spell I wish was a lot better than what it is because it's extremely cool. What it does is summon this holy turret that can follow you around and basically just shoot enemies while you can just do your own thing. But unfortunately, once again, the damage is just not there, especially for how much mana that it actually does consume as well. Something like Piercing Light, which consumes way less mana, can just do more damage than the entire barrage of hits that the Radiant Guardian actually does do. I feel like they should just definitely boost the damage or make it just hit a bunch more times because it only hits like 5 times very slowly. Now, I guess it does have the use of just being able to use it before you actually enter the boss room, and then you can just get a bunch of free damage off that way. But for 52 mana, I'd rather spend that elsewhere. Number 17, we have Cleansing Spring. Now, this spell actually summons a Radiant Pool of Light, of which when you stand inside of it, actually does remove all types of status effects and status buildup. Now, this actually does sound pretty decent, but unfortunately, it does consume 72 mana, which isn't really worth it, being that a lot of the status effects in this game aren't really that powerful. You can counteract them pretty easily, and there are additional items which you can use to just heal those type of status effects. But this thing does actually have a very low requirement, so if you had something like a strength-based build, you could just throw in this Catalyst, put on this spell right here, and probably just benefit. But the fact that it is very situational means it's going to get lower on the list. Number 16, we have Healing Radiance. Now, this is a healing-based spell, of which actually does have a relatively quick animation, but it does not heal you for much at all, and it consumes 96 mana, which is way too much. And also, the healing-based spells work the exact same way as your regular healing item does, and that when you're withered, it actually just doesn't benefit as much for some reason. Kind of wish that the healing-based spells kind of counteracted that, but this spell does actually work very early on, but almost every other type of healing-based spell is just much better than this one. Number 15, we have Invigorating Aura. Now, this is a spell of which actually does offer you passive health regen. Now, from my testing, it is roughly about 30 HP per second if you don't include the withering effect, which honestly can be really good. However, once again, it consumes way too much mana. Its initial cost is only 12, but every single second afterwards while the buff is active, it consumes an additional 5 mana. Which means if this spell is lasting about a minute, that means you're actually using over 300 mana, which is just ridiculous. And very similar to the Barbed Aura spell, this actually only runs out after your mana bar is completely depleted, or if you actually do manually remove the spell itself, which I think is probably a bug. But if you don't actually plan on using any other types of spells and you just want something for more health, then you could just use this before you actually enter the boss room. You don't have to worry about it because it's just passive, and you can benefit that way. But with how much mana it actually does consume, I don't see this spell lasting anything longer than a minute. Number 14, we have Oris's Judgment. Now, this spell actually does summon a whole bunch of these lightning strikes from the sky, which actually can do some okay damage, but I'm kind of confused as to what this one's supposed to actually be, because I want to see it as a crowd control spell and actually hitting multiple enemies at once, but sometimes it hyperfixates on one particular target, and this spell is not really meant to be a single target type of spell because the total overall damage isn't really there. Because for 120 mana, there are other types of spells that will end up doing more total overall damage. And also for that type of mana as well, there's pretty other spells that are pretty better at crowd control. So this one kind of does like half of both, but nothing too well. And it does have a 35 radiance requirement as well, which is still pretty high. Number 13, we have Aura of Tenacity. Now this spell works very similar to Invigorating Aura, except this buff actually just gives you passive damage negation. Now from my testing, it's about 25% more damage negation, which actually is really decent. Now, the reason I'm going to prefer this over Invigorating Aura is because, one, I prefer damage negation more than health regen in almost every single instance, and it only consumes 2 FP per second compared to the Invigorating Aura 5 FP per second. But yes, it still works the exact same way, and that's throughout the entire duration of the buff, it just constantly drains that mana until you just run out in general, or unless you just unequip the spell. Now, honestly, I just wish that these spells just did not work this way. Wish that it only consumes like 100 mana and this lasted a minute and that was it. But this spell can actually be pretty decent early on because you do get it right at the beginning and it only has an 8 radiance requirement as well. So yeah, you can't really go wrong with 25% more damage negation. At number 12, we have Radiant Slash. Now, I want to put this one a lot higher on the list because this one can easily be the best Radiant crowd control spell in the entire game, but it can be very inconsistent. Now, this spell itself actually does summon this big wave of holy damage, of which can actually do some decent damage, does have a nice horizontal spread, and for 60 mana, it's not too bad because having a whole bunch of enemies in front of you, which does happen a lot, by the way, and just killing them all at once with the Radiant Slash can be very nice if it actually works like that every single time, which it doesn't, because there's plenty of times to where like it just dissipates as soon as it hits one enemy or it clips something that it doesn't do any damage at all. I don't know why it's so inconsistent in that regard, but if I actually did this pierce through things and just go straight through them every single time, it would be a lot higher, because this thing as a single target damaging spell isn't really that great. Something like Radiant Flare or Piercing Light can just outperform it, because even though those things might do less damage, they have way cheaper costs in the mana department to where the total overall damage is a lot better. Number 11, we have Consecrate. Now, this spell actually does summon this Holy Circle, of which when enemies are inside of it, that is take a lot of damage over time. Now, the damage is probably not worth the 120 mana cost that it actually does have, but this spell actually does have some very nice synergy with the Sanctify spell, of which also summons this Holy Circle, but that one actually does heal you inside of it. So, having both of these spells stacked on top of one another means you just get health regen and just do some damage over time, and it is a relatively large circle, so it is good at crowd control and hitting multiple enemies at once, more so than probably most of the other spells that you'll see on this list. But obviously the reason why it's not going to get a bit higher is because there are other spells that are more mana efficient in their damage department. Number 10, we have Healing Sigil. Now this is another healing type spell, and this one is just a buffed up version of Healing Radiance because it heals for about twice the amount. And it doesn't even consume that much more mana as well, so this one's just going to be the obvious better option. Now once again, trying to heal in the withered state is not going to be that beneficial, but as you can see, when you're just regular damaged, you actually do benefit greatly. On the gameplay right now, I'm about at 30 vitality, and it heals for about half of my health bar. Now there are some other spells that heal more efficiently than this one in terms of how much more health you actually do gain, but being that it is like an instant heal means that it's probably more reliable, and it only has an 8 radiance requirement as well, which is really nice. Number 9, we have Lucent Beam. Now this spell is just like your holy based Kamehameha wave because it's just a big ass beam that goes relatively far, not as far as something like Radiant Flare does do, but still pretty decent distance. And the damage itself is actually really nice, and being that it's like nice and quick and it's constant damage, you can just keep flicking it between enemies and end up killing them pretty quickly. But the only downside once again is going to be the FP cost. Now thankfully it actually doesn't have any type of starting up cost, but when you're holding on to it, from my testing, it's roughly about 50 FP per second, which yeah, is a lot, but it still can melt a bunch of different things in that time as well. Hence it's still being an A tier. Number 8, we have a Divine Arms. Now this is a spell of which actually summons a bunch of these holy swords to which they track towards enemies. Whatever one is actually closest to will end up tracking towards that. Doesn't really matter what you're locked onto. I just notice it has a mind of its own sometimes, which can be a blessing and a curse, because sometimes it can just go track towards the thing that you just definitely do not want it to track towards, which could definitely be the worst thing about this. But the best thing about the spell is that for once, this one is actually not too expensive, only 46 mana, and for how much damage that it actually does do if every single one of those swords do hit a target, it can be very nice. But for me, I just like to use this thing locked off, just use it and end up tracking towards whatever's closest to you. So this one is probably going to be my favorite crowd control spell out of all the Radiant type of spells, because for how much damage that actually does do, and for 46 mana, you can't really go wrong. Number 7, we have Sanctify. Now, as I was mentioning earlier, this spell actually does summon a Holy Circle, to which when standing inside of it, does actually give you some health regen. Now, for my testing, the health regen is roughly 30 HP per second for about 30 seconds, which if I'm not bad at math, that's roughly 900 HP, which is definitely the most in the entire game out of all the other spells. Now, the downsides to this is that, yes, you're going to have to stand inside of the circle, and it's not an instant heal, it's healing over time. But 900 HP for only 120 mana is definitely a really good deal. At number 6, we have Piercing Lights. Now, this is just the buffed up version of a Radiant Flare, of which is a very nice projectile attack, goes very far, have nice tracking, and do some decent damage. But the reason why I'm not going to prefer it over Radiant Flare is because this thing only gets 25 to 30% more damage, but it consumes way more than twice the amount of mana, which once again, mana efficient spells are just going to be better in my opinion. But if you do have an abundance of mana stones and plenty to spare, then I might as well just go with Piercing Light because it's just going to end up doing more damage per hit. But the reason why it's still going to get this high is because it does have the specific use of actually going through enemies, whereas Radiant Flare doesn't actually go through them. So it actually does have the benefit of just hitting multiple enemies at once and crowd control. But yes, they do have to be like lined up perfectly basically. So it's going to be a little bit more situational, but it is still a very nice spell to have. Number 5, we have Blessed Reflections. Now I want to put this spell at number 1. If we're just a little bit more consistent, it feels like it's a common theme going on here. Just things that is not that consistent or just consume too much mana. But for this spell in particular, it does do a lot of damage. And for 99 mana, it is definitely worth it. Because basically this spell just summons 2 different types of like spirit projections, of which just come crash into the ground and just do a whole bunch of damage. And if both of them hit, there's like nothing more in the game that can actually do as much damage in terms of radiant spells. And the cool thing is about this spell as well is that when you use it at a distance, they actually turn into projectiles. So it actually can do a projectile as well. But the reasons as to why I don't really care much about this spell is that when you're using it in narrow corridors, it can be very jank. Sometimes only one can come out. And if you use it at like a certain type of distance where it's like half, it's just going to miss instead of actually doing the projectile. But in boss fights, this is definitely one that I'm going to be using every single time because it just does do that much damage, but it feels more consistent and not as jank. I would like to put it higher. At number 4, we have Radiant Weapon. Now this actually just buff you up and with more holy damage for about 90 seconds, which is very long. Now in terms of how much more damage it actually does add on, I'm not too sure. I tried to test it out. My stupid brain couldn't really figure it out. From what I'm guessing, it's roughly like a flat damage buff of about 100 holy damage, and it actually adds some more bonus on top of that depending on how much spell power your catalyst actually does have. But the reason as to why this one's going to get this high is because in a game where your spells are going to be secondary options, having something to just boost the damage of your regular weapon is going to be extremely beneficial. And compared to things like your regular minor salts that you do get in the game, they don't really last that long, where something like this is still pretty cheap in terms of mana. You can use it multiple times throughout the fight and it lasts 90 seconds. So you can even use it throughout the overworld, just exploring from checkpoint to checkpoint. So you should basically have this one on at all times. At number 3, we have Radiant Flare. Now, as I was mentioning before with the Piercing Light, this one is going to be the lesser version because it doesn't do as much damage, but it consumes way less mana to the point where it's going to do more total overall damage because this thing does actually go just as far, does actually get that nice tracking as well. And for 16 mana, the damage itself is actually still pretty decent. And being able to just sit at the back of the map and just pick enemies off at a distance is always going to be really nice. Now, against enemies with like larger health pools and bosses and things like that, you're going to notice it's not going to be doing that much damage. It's definitely going to be tickling them a whole bunch. So I probably just save this one for like the trash mobs instead. But for 16 mana and a low radiance requirement, you can't really go wrong. At number 2, we have Lacerating Weapon. Now, this is another weapon buff that is very similar to Radiant Weapon. Both last 90 seconds, both add some more damage, both consume 60 mana. Now, the reason I'm going to prefer Lacerating Weapon a bit more, even though that the damage buff is not going to be as great as Radiant Weapon, this one actually does add the benefit of the Bleed status effect. Now, Bleed just means that enemies are just going to take chunk damage over time, and they'll end up being more vulnerable to just physical damage in general. To which almost every single weapon in the game, it does physical damage, so you're just always going to benefit of just using this one instead. Well, not always, because obviously some enemies are going to be more weaker to holy damage, of which when the enemies are weaker to holy damage, I would rather just go with the Radiant Weapon. But in most cases, Lacerating Weapon is just going to be the better play. Number 1, we have Radiant Orb, which is a spell that just gets basically everything. It's a projectile that goes relatively far. It explodes and has like a very nice AoE, of which actually when enemies are standing inside of it, just get damaged pretty decently, so it's good at crowd control as well. And when you're standing inside of the orb, you actually end up getting healed, which is insane. And it only consumes 59 mana, which is cheaper than some of the other things in the game, like Lucent Beam or Radiant Slash. And the funny thing is that the healing effect is actually better than what you actually get of Healing Radiance, which is a whole dedicated healing spell, of which consumes over 90 mana, whereas this spell with only 59 mana just performs better. Now, the only downside I could say about this thing is that the damage is not going to be as good as some of the other spells that you could see. And it actually doesn't stay on impact, it just goes straight through enemies sometimes, which obviously can be good, but if you actually want to benefit off that healing effect, you're going to have to go ahead and chase it. So I just recommend just throwing it at the ground while you are fighting a boss or an enemy, and you just benefit that way. So yes, for that reason, I consider Radiant Orb to be the best Radiant spell in the entire game. Anyway, that pretty much concludes it for this one. As always, please do like and subscribe because I do have some more Lords of the Fallen videos coming along the way. If you do have a particular video in mind, if you want me to see me rank the Inferno spells or the Umbral spells, let me know down in the comments. And please do follow me on Twitch as well because I am live there every single day. I probably will be doing a challenge run by the time this video is out. Probably doing a broken bucket only run. That'll be stupid. Definitely going to do that though. Anyway, see you guys in the next one. Bye.